And with that, I'd like to introduce him, Oliver Putz, to deliver a lecture on What Good is God to Animals? Human Uniqueness in Theology and Science. Please welcome him again.
Thank you. Thanks, Mick. If after this talk you happen to think like, oh my God, why did they hire him? Think what they will feel. So, you know. All right. What I want to talk to you about is what good God is to animals. And I want to push what we've said so far, or heard so far about in the talks today, a little further. I mean, we're progressing here in an evolutionary session, so to speak. I want to ask something about the relationship between God and animals, some animals in particular. So I want to start with an observation that many primatologists have actually made, chief among them Jane Goodall, and it's that chimpanzees at sight of water start to act strangely. Goodall sees this in a waterfall at Gombe National Park in Tanzania where she worked, and she's observed this since the 60s. So when the apes come to the waterfall, and sometimes you see it in rainfall too, they start to move rhythmically. The hair stands on end. They swing into the water. They throw rocks at the water. They vocalize. This goes on, very agitated state, biologically, by the way, absolutely incomprehensible. It makes no sense at all. It goes on for a little while, and then after that, they actually go back into a tree or sit on a stone and sit quietly and watch the water silently. And Goodall asks a very provocative and I think intriguing question. She asks, is it not possible that the chimpanzees are responding to some feeling like awe? Was it perhaps similar feelings of awe that gave rise to the first animistic religions, the worship of the elements and the mysteries of nature over which there was no control? Only when our prehistoric ancestors developed language would it have been possible to discuss such internal feelings and create a shared religion. So what she's suggesting is, could it be that they prefigure theological sensitivity? Well, the word awe is interesting here, and I tell you why, because awe is indeed an aspect of religious experience. Think about how Abraham Joshua Heschel talks about experiencing nature. He says the following. He says, there are three aspects of nature which command man's attention: power, loveliness, and grandeur. Power he exploits, loveliness he enjoys, grandeur fills him with awe. There's the awe. What smites us with unquenchable amazement is not that which we grasp and are able to convey, but that which lies within our reach, but beyond our grasp. Not the quantitative aspects of nature, but something qualitative, not what is beyond our range in time and space, but the true meaning, source, and end of being, in other words, the ineffable. So I want to push this whole thing a little further. I want to ask a hopefully equally intriguing question. If nothing else, it's at least provocative, I hope. I want to ask, could it be that some non-human animals are actually aware of the ineffable? And the way that I want to go about this is this. I will try to show here today that self-conscious non-human animals, it's not all animals, but self-conscious non-human animals, are capable of the transcendental experience of absolute being. I will unpack that in a second, which gives them a preconceptual understanding of God. And I would say that that constitutes a proto-religiosity and a species-specific personal relationship with God. Okay, nobody throws shoes at me, so I will continue. There are two pillars on which my argument will rest here. One is a theology of experience, and then in an analogy, looking through cognitive ethology, relating that to animals. So let's start with the theology of experience. And here I turn to a man you've heard a lot about, Clara, and I'm always told that I pronounce him wrong, so it's Karl Rahner. I know. Bob, I apologize. Where's Bob there? So Karl Rahner's theological project. And what is it? You heard some of that today, but let me rephrase this a little bit again in my own words and hopefully doing justice to the old man. And yes, he looks grumpy. He wasn't quite as grumpy as he looks, so I've been told. Okay. What is his question? Basically, his overall question is, what are the necessary conditions of the possibility of receiving God's revelation? In other words, what about the human being makes it capable of being, as he likes to call it, or like to call it, a hearer of the word? What do we have to basically be in this personal relationship with God? And he starts from a place that Paul was mentioning today, a particular theology, a particular doctrine of God. First, he sees the human being as a potentia obedientialis for the gratuitous and salvific divine self-communication. What he means by that is basically he turns to St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas says that human beings have a national proclivity to desire God, and Rana says that's exactly what we are. We are this potentia obedientialis. We have a natural proclivity or a desire to know God. And that is put into a context of a scotistic doctrine of God. And I would summarize it like this, that according to Scotus, God creates the world in order to communicate God's self, and creation exists to receive the unowed free divine self-gift. So the idea of creation, as Paul said earlier, it's not, the incarnation, for example, for Scotus, was not about redeeming our sins. That was something that happened, but it was not the main idea. The idea was a loving relationship into which we, as creation, are invited. So it's the relationship that is important here. Now, how does Rana then see us as human beings experiencing God? And here he turns toward a man that I will talk about a little bit and hopefully not drive you all out of the room, Martin Heidegger, who's an acquired taste philosophically. It's kind of difficult, I admit that. But basically what Rana is saying is this. The human being as spirit or subject asks the Seinsfrage, the question about the meaning of being as such. Now, what is being as such? What he turns to here is really Heidegger's idea of the ontological difference between beings, right, like this here or myself, concrete beings, and being itself as the ground in which concrete beings are grounded. Think about it this way. We all are beings. We can be categorized into humans, chairs, or tables, but we all possess being, or to put it even better, we are all grounded in the fact that we have being. That's what you have to have first before you can be categorized, right? And that's, Heidegger calls this ontological difference. He liked word games on the things that are logos as the ground of it all, right? So what Rana is suggesting is the following. The human being, and here he follows again our friend Heidegger, is Dasein. It's a being that is thrown into the world to try to understand its own being as such. And how do we do that? Well, Rana calls this, interestingly, the Vorgriff onto being. Now, Vorgriff is a technical term that he uses from Heidegger, and as it's proper to do, he just changes it around, defines it really differently. And it's been translated many times in many ways, pre-apprehension of being and so forth. But really what it is the capacity of the human being to reach beyond the sense, the objects of its sense experiences, including oneself. So you experience yourself, you have a sense of self, but you don't necessarily have it as a sense of me, as the word me. You don't think of yourself every time you look into the mirror, you go, oh, me. You don't do that. You basically have an ontological experience of yourself. You experience yourself as a being doing something in the world, as being in the world. But you become to yourself a question, namely the question about the meaning of your being. And this Vorgriff, that you can reach beyond these objects of your sense experience, that can happen all the time, not only looking at yourself, not only looking at something that instills you with awe, that is the Grand Canyon or a waterfall. It can happen even with the most benign and boring thing like a laser pointer, right? Ultimately, the metaphysical question, why is there something and not nothing? The meaning of your own being. Now, Rana answers that question in a very interesting way. He says what happens is that in every sense experience or historical concrete experience, there's always also given an experience that is transcendental, namely the experience of this being as such, that which you reach beyond, right? And he says that this reach goes onto the totality of subsisting being, not existing being, but subsisting being. And what would that be? That subsisting being in which all is grounded would be, as Thomas says, Deus est ipsum esse subsistens. That would be God. The totality of all subsisting being, of being as such, as it were, is God. God does not exist, God subsists, because creation exists, right? So what that means is actually that in every moment that we experience something, there's a transcendental experience given with it, which is an experience of God. And that is pre-conceptual. It's not that we think God. It is the sense of being grounded in a mystery that is both our whence and whither. Brings us back to what Heschel was talking about, brings us back to what Jane Goodall was talking about, the sense of awe. Right? The sense of awe that you experience when you are at a family dinner or when you drive down the street by the Grand Canyon and you look out of the window and it stops you in mid-sentence. I told my class about that. They know what I mean. It's hard to stop me from talking. That did. The sense of awe, right? That would be this preconceptual experience of something. And Rana would argue it's the experience of being as such, the totality of being as such, which is God. So every experience that you have brings with it the possibility of an experience of God. Could be a revelatory experience. Why do we have that? Well, here, Rana differs from Heidegger. Heidegger says it's because we're afraid of non-being. That's why we're always concerned about our being. Rana sees this slightly differently. He says, because we're divinely constituted that way. God, in what he calls a in an ontological act that is basically a quasi-formal causation, God, in an act of grace, instills in us the desire for God as the most rock bottom, if you like, constituent of our being, which he calls, using Heidegger here, an existential. And that existential, since it comes from God, is a supernatural existential. What does that allow us to do? Well, it allows us to desire God. So the reason that we have that capacity is because God made us such. Now, if we look at theology of experience then, what we can say is, summarizing that part of the argument, self-conscious beings ask the Seinsfrage about being as such. They are to themselves the question of the meaning of being. And they reach onto that being as such, by means of that Vorgriff, this pre-apprehension of being. And in each historical, categorical experience, there is also given this revelatory transcendental experience of God. So self-conscious beings are events of this divine self-communication, this ontological act in which we are constituted that way, which means that self-conscious beings are always also transcendentally conscious. Rana's argument is this: you as human beings, capable of knowing and experiencing yourself, also experience God. You might reject that in your reflection on the experience of self, but the fact is, he would argue, you experience God. You're always in a very intimate relationship with God, because that's how we are made. What does that have to do with animals? Well, if non-human self-consciousness implies transcendental consciousness, could we actually say that it would be the same for animals? And then the question would be, well, how do we show that? How can we show non-human self-consciousness? And here I come to cognitive ethology, so the study of animals, behavior, and the possibility of mind in animals. And in cognitive ethology, a lot has happened, but in order to understand or to discuss how the scientific data could tell us anything about self-consciousness, let's try to operationalize it. As scientists, we need to operationalize things so we can actually look for them. Now, I would suggest this, that self-consciousness is really a division of the self, as you experience yourself, into a subjective self, that self which does the experiencing, and an objective self, that which you experience, which is yourself. Now, unless you think of yourself as somebody else, in which case you probably need to up your meds, you experience yourself as an undivided self. The reason for that, I would argue, is that there is an internal self-symbolization where the objective self becomes to the subjective self the ontological, the participating and representational symbol of the undivided self. Okay, that sounds a little bit like philosophical wizardry, but bear with me here. Now, how can that help us with animals? It helps me with you guys by saying, how are you doing? And you say, fine, if you just stop this talk very quickly. Then I know you have self-consciousness. You respond to me. you may not have good taste, but that's a different question. Now, can I do this with an animal? Sure, I can. I just probably will not get a very good answer. What can I do with animals? Well, how about, is it possible to externalize this self-symbolization? And I would argue it is. Think about mirror self-recognition. If you look at yourself in the mirror, what you see is yourself. You don't look usually in the mirror and say, I wonder how that guy got into the bathroom. You don't see your body and say, well, that's part of me. You see yourself as a whole person. So here too, the self is divided in a subjective and an objective self. The subjective self being the one who looks into the mirror and experiences the mirror image as self. Then there's the objective self, the one who is reflected. And that is externalized now into the image, into the actual mirror image. And now the mirror image is an externalized self-symbolization. Right? You look at yourself in the mirror and you recognize, that's me in all my depth as a person. Now we have something. Now we have something to use in our study. What if we did that with chimpanzees or other animals? And it has been done. Most of you are probably familiar with these studies. Gordon Gallup did it with chimpanzees for the first time in 1970, and the reason he did it was, well, comparative psychologists and behavioral biologists do crazy things, and he put a mirror in front of chimpanzees to see what happens, and after a while, the animals stopped acting surprised or showing social behavior towards the image, and they started what everybody else does who looked in the mirror. They go like, oh my God, look at that. Okay. Does this hair make my butt look big? You know, that sort of thing. And he figured that therefore, that was not really very professional, I apologize for that, but as my students know, anything for a cheap laugh. And what he suggested then was, okay, could it be that the animals actually make the connection of the mirror image and themselves? If they do, how can we test that to be certain? And he came up with this mark test, and that has been used now also in human beings to determine at what point children, infants, toddlers, at what point do they really develop this mirror self-recognition for the first time. Basically what he did is he anesthetized the animals, and then he put these marks on their forehead, right? So you have something on the ear here and here. This color is odorless as far as we know. The animals don't know that they have it on there. Then he let them wake up, and he presented them with a mirror. What would you expect? Well, you would expect some type of mark-oriented behavior. That is, if they recognize themselves, right? It's the same thing as looking at yourself, and you get it. Now, if you look before the test, let's just, you take animals, you put them before a mirror, and you see how oftentimes their hands go up to the brow, to eyebrow or ear, and you see, well, it happens occasionally, but not very often. In the control, you basically leave out the color. But here are the animals that were tested, that were actually given these marks, and you see there's an increase in mark-directed responses, which suggests that they actually recognize themselves. And if you think, well, I don't know, that sounds good, but what does it really look like? I brought this. Here's a female orangutan, and you see here the mirror. This is mostly shot through the mirror. So here, and now we look through the mirror, and you look at this female, and there's the mark-oriented behavior. Okay? So you might say, okay, yeah, but what happens? Is that really so important? I mean, is that really on her mind now? Look what happens when she turns away from the mirror. The mirror is not even there anymore. Right? So that's a positive result on the mark test. Now, I would argue that is actually telling us something here. That's really important. Well, it was not only found in great apes. It's been shown in all great apes. It's also been found in elephants, and dolphins, and in magpies, believe it or not, and in some birds. And in all these animals, they have a mark somewhere, and you see mark-directed behavior. Now, you might ask, how would mark-directed behavior in magpies look? You have that dot on the bird, and the bird is going absolutely crazy, trying, no hands, right? Trying to get to that point, jumping around, getting very excited, right? So that's really mark-oriented behavior. Now, you might say, great, now we have mirror self-recognition. Does that not mean that therefore we have self-consciousness? And that therefore every animal that does not show a positive result in the mark response test, therefore does not have it? Well, always remember that absence of proof is not proof of absence. Think of dogs. We heard about the relationship that Professor Dean Drummond talked about, animals and human beings. With dogs, the question that is really important for us to ask is who domesticated who? No, I'm not joking. I'm good for cheap jokes. That was not one of them. Animals, dogs are obviously we're wolves and we're domesticated by us, sure, but at the same time, it was only because we lived in close proximity and relationship with these dogs that we could actually become who we are. So the question really is, who domesticated who? It was a clear case of coevolution, right? And as a result, what you find is actually that dogs are very good at gaze control, something that, at gaze following, something that chimpanzees are not. So if you call a dog and you have things hidden and you look at the thing that is hidden and the dog knows you and trusts you, will immediately grab it, right? You do that with a chimpanzee and they, you have these 3 cups and they will just go. And there's a good reason why they don't trust you. In their natural environment that has a strong hierarchical order. No male chimpanzee would tell another chimpanzee, hey, do you want some food? No, you get beaten up if you take the food from somebody who's higher in the food chain, right? So you basically don't trust anyone. Dogs do that because they co-evolved with us, but they fail the mirror self-recognition test miserably. That does not say that they might have something that scientists call the theory of mind. We've heard about that a little bit yesterday. Now, Primack and Woodruff, in a paper from 1978, talked about chimpanzees, and they say that maybe chimpanzees have a theory of mind. And what they say is this: in saying that an individual has a theory of mind, we mean that the individual imputes mental state to himself and others. A system of inferences of this kind is properly viewed as a theory, first because such states are not directly observable, and second, because the system can be made to make predictions specifically about the behavior of other organisms. So, as we heard yesterday, the idea is you, as a self-conscious being, look at another self-conscious being, hopefully, and what you can do is actually you can somehow put yourself in the other one's shoes and kind of reconstruct what their desire, needs, wants are, right? Well, that's really that you have a theory about what it is they need or want. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, obviously, a lot of adults do that, but ask yourself if you do this all the time. You might do that right now, looking up at me and thinking, okay, what is he after? But if you interact with a good friend over dinner, is that really what you do? Are you really having a theory of whether he wants more wine or bread or whatever? So what Dan Zahavi, a philosopher of self-consciousness, says, he says, well, is that really plausible that the experience of self and of others are theoretical, inferential, and quasi-scientific in nature? He really approaches this from an ontological point of view, and that's really, again, the idea of the experience, of an experiential point of view, where we don't use theory as much as really that we feel ourselves into the other, right? So from this point of view, can there still be something that tells us there's intersubjectivity, be it in humans or in animals? Well, in animals, I think there's good evidence. I'm sticking to the chimpanzees here, but this has been found in other animals as well, as I mentioned before. There is good indications for true intersubjectivity and the capacity to feel yourself into the other, or empathy. Now, if you look at these guys, this is an adult. Here are juveniles. And what this adult is doing is, I think it's a she, cracks a nut. Now, nut cracking is terribly tricky for chimpanzees because though they have an opposable thumb, it's not very strong. What you have to do is actually you have to find your tools, tool use, big point here. You have to find the tools and use them properly, and it takes a while to learn this. What you have to find is a good, strong stone on the bottom, then you have a good shaped stone with which to crack the nut. You put the nut on there and you crack it. Clack. Okay. Now, these guys have to learn. The way they learn it is, as Franz de Waal describes it, or better, he takes that from a Japanese primatologist. The way they learn it is actually like a sushi chef. The sushi chef will not tell the apprentice, look, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. The apprentice is there to observe, the sushi chef does. But in order for the sushi chef to do it in such a way that the apprentice can learn, the sushi chef has to do it slowly. deliberate moves so you understand what's going on. That suggests that you know or feel yourself into the other, getting an idea of, having an idea of what it is they actually see or can see. Now, all primates are very, very sweet with their kids, but there are limits. Parents know what I'm talking about. In these moments, these adults are terribly, terribly patient. Sometimes these young ones really climb on them in order to look down. And what the adult will do, take the nut, slowly place it down, taking the stone, showing almost, see what I'm doing? And then that's how they learn it. So teaching is a good example, I think, to show that there is this intersubjectivity, this feeling into the other, this empathy. We also find in great apes reconciliation. And reconciliation is basically similar to what you might find in human beings. You have a fight with someone, you reconcile afterwards, you go to the loser and you say, look, come on, let's make up, let's have a beer or whatever it is that you do when you make up with a friend. Right? The way that chimpanzees do that is one beats up the other, the one that is beaten up climbs into a tree, is scared, the other one eventually, once everybody has calmed down a little bit, goes up the tree, reaches out a hand and says, okay, come on, relax, let's get together. Again, you see that there is something here that requires more than just being a machine responding to sensory input. Right? What is important here is really that it's these are highly social species. Consolation is another thing that you see. So when an animal is distressed because it was beaten up or something happened, another animal might come around and really hug, really just be there and try to console the one who had something happen to him or her. Now, why in the world would they console? You could say it's pro-social behavior. Sure, it is pro-social. But does that not require that you have a little bit more of an understanding of the other than to say, okay, this is what I have to do in order for our troop here or our group to be healthy and reproduce more, right? So here too, I think clear indications that these animals have more than just pro-social behavior, but truly an intersubjectivity. And then finally, and this you may have heard about, what you see here is a group of chimpanzees in Africa these are all animals that they're not in captivity. What happened was that they were actually caught or found as juveniles because their parents were killed in the bushmeat trade. And they're being held here until they hopefully can be brought back into the wild. But here's this group, and there is one of the older adults that died. And you find, and of course a lot of scientists say, well, yeah, this is anthropocentric, interpretation of what you're seeing. But what you really see is this, again, biologically hard to explain behavior. It's without any function and that you can see. What these animals are doing is really they are stunned. They're sad. Some of these animals will go when they lose either their offspring or their parents will go into something that we can best describe as depression. Females will carry around their juveniles until they're actually mummified and won't let go. If you think, well, that's because they're machines, trust me, talk to firemen and ask them how many mummified people they have found in the home of families, and the husband will say, but I talked to her yesterday. That happens a lot. So there is the capacity, I would argue, for mourning. Now that, I think, these data together really show very strongly, make a strong case for intersubjectivity in some animals. So what can we say then? Cognitive ethology shows us that at least the great apes, but as I said, a lot of other animals would count in here as well, test positive in the mark test. Right? They have mirror self-recognition. There's good evidence for intersubjectivity, and if you take all that together, I would argue that there are some non-human animals that are self-conscious. Now, again, self-consciousness, well, I get to that later. Let me see what we can do with that and put it together. Mike, how do I do it on, Mick, 5 minutes, right? Great, perfect. So what can that tell us in the greater scheme of the question that I started with? Well, we asked, could these animals have an experience of the transcendent or of the ineffable? And if you take that now in consideration of what Rana told us, we have that experience, you would argue, because of the capacity of reaching beyond the objects of our sense experiences onto the underlying being itself, this Vorgriff. Now, would we have that in animals as well? Well, we could assume so if they truly are self-conscious and intersubjects. So animals too have a self-experience. Obviously, they don't, even on their best day, would not think me, but they experience themselves. And they can therefore posit the question of their meaning. Now, remember, I did not say that the question of meaning is something you pose and try to answer in words. The important thing is that this is all on a preconceptual level. As I like to say in my class, you can talk about time and an explanation of time, and then we talk to the cosmologists and they will tell us something where time comes from, and then we talk to the mechanics and they will tell us how they keep it. At the end of the day, what we can say is how we explain time. What we don't understand is what it means to be a mortal human being existing in time. And the way that we ask that question about the meaning as a mortal being in time is not that we think about that necessarily at conferences, although we do. But you all do it when you get up in the morning, knowing fully well that this might be the last day of your life. You do it when you bring life into this world, knowing fully well that this is a being towards death. So we negotiate that actually by merely being in the world and how we live our lives in the world. That's really how we pose the question and try to go about answering it. It's an ontological approach, right? So I would say on that level, these self-conscious animals do exactly the same. And they can do this, of course, also when they experience other things. I took a banana here, could be something else. Choose whatever you like. The point, again, is the awe about that there is something and not nothing. And if that's the case, then by analogy, I know arguments from analogy are tricky, but I'm daring them. I would argue that for these animals too, in every categorical, historical experience, there's also a transcendental experience of being itself, that this Vorgriff, this reach, goes onto the totality of subsisting being, which is being itself, which is God, Deus est ipsum esse subsistens, and that therefore the transcendental experience in these animals is an unthematized experience of God. Again, unthematized. It's not that they think God, they experience this underlying mystery of being itself as that in which they're grounded and to which they're drawn. So, what does that mean? I would argue that self-conscious non-human animals lack language. We're all in agreement with that. Yeah, they have some language abilities, I know. People often then ask, well, what about the sign language and so forth? Yes, they have some language capacities, but they're highly limited. So they have no language, and therefore they have no religion. Religion would require a narrative, it would require scripture, it would require the exchange on that narrative, on that shared narrative. They don't have that. But they are transcendentally conditioned, and therefore they have this preconceptual or unthematized knowledge or experience, understanding of God. And I would call that proto-religion, because that's what you have to have in order to even engage in a religious dialogue. So I would argue then that these animals are in a personal relationship with God, and I would argue that it is a species-specific personal relationship with God. Now, if you ask me what good is God to animals, as both a biologist and a theologian, I would say it's exactly that. It's that personal relationship in which we can negotiate the meaning of our being. And that fits then very nicely, I think, I hope. Maybe the speakers will disagree, but with some of what we have talked about before. So with that, thank you, and now a picture of my favorite primate. I thought, okay.